Good afternoon and welcome. During the entire webinar, we'll provide simultaneous translation, Spanish-English, English-Spanish. You can choose the language of your preference in the lower horizontal menu and the interpretation button. Buenas tardes y bienvenidos al webinar Arpel. Los principales temas a considerar en 2023 respecto al petróleo y gas. Una descripción estratégica para los líderes de la industria. Contaremos con interpretación simultánea español-inglés, inglés-español. Pueden seleccionar el idioma de su preferencia en el menú horizontal inferior. Este webinar se desarrolla en el marco del programa de alta gerencia de Arpel para dar a conocer parte de su contenido, instructores y metodología. Para conocer más sobre este programa de liderazgo, les compartiremos un enlace en el chat. En este webinar contamos con 2 de los 4 instructores del programa. Bob Fryklund. Él es el jefe de estrategias de Upstream en S&P Global Commodities Insights. Cuenta con 43 años de experiencia trabajando para grandes empresas, trabajadores independientes y consultoras, desempeñándose en puestos de liderazgo ejecutivo en la mayoría de ellas. Su labor se centra en asesorar a empresas, consejos de administración y equipos directivos en áreas que conducen a la creación de valor de alto impacto, carteras, OPB, reestructuraciones, fusiones y adquisiciones. Es un experto mundialmente reconocido en Upstream y recibió el premio Presidents de la APG por su liderazgo intelectual. Orador habitual en actos públicos y privados, también es un conocido moderador y fuente de información para los medios de comunicación. Bob retribuye a la industria asesorando a mujeres líderes y forma parte de varios consejos industriales. Arpel, APG, CAB y APG Trustee Associates. Es licenciado en Geología por el Hamilton College y reside en Houston, Texas. También contamos con la presencia de Felipe Perez. Felipe es estratega de Downstream para Latinoamérica y director de mercados de petróleo, Midstream y Downstream para América en IHS Markit S&P Global, con sede en Los Ángeles, California. Tiene 15 años de experiencia en consultoría en las industrias de petróleo y gas, principalmente en el sector Downstream. Se unió a IHS Markit en 2017. Su principal objetivo es ayudar a los clientes a mejorar el rendimiento y las iniciativas estratégicas. Su experiencia se centra en la conectividad de los mercados de combustible, PADD5 y América del Norte y América Latina. Antes de unirse a IHS Markit S&P Global, Felipe trabajó como consultor senior y ejecutivo de desarrollo de negocios en KBC junto a los principales clientes de América Latina. Es licenciado en Ingeniería Química por la Universidad de Sao Paulo, Brasil, y obtuvo un máster en Diseño y Operación de Refinerías de la Universidad de Manchester, Inglaterra. Habla español, portugués e inglés de manera fluida. Le agradecemos mucho la presencia a Bob y Felipe por acompañarnos y presentarnos ante los postulantes al programa y otros invitados para hablar sobre estrategias en la industria del petróleo y gas y sus principales desafíos durante el 2023. Adelante, Bob y Felipe.
Thank you, Irene. As we look to the future in oil and gas, and in particular in energy, there are a number of key themes that continue to evolve. And just to start off, I'll put a few out there that we're watching right now. The first one that probably, and not necessarily will be these in order of importance, but the first one that pops right out when we think of the top 3 in the world right now is the economy. And the question or the issue around it is much broader than just a typical GDP number. It really boils down to inflation. We also look then at what's happening on with the cost of capital. As credit has become a lot tighter, that affects our business and many businesses across the board. We also look at the overall economy slowing down. This year and next year, we see GDP that's going to be less than 3%. And that starts to put somewhat of pressure on oil and gas markets, particularly on the pricing side of things. And that's why we're seeing some dislocations in prices. They're very different for different kinds of crudes, but it also means assets that are on the market are having a different effect as well based on this. You've seen some deals get canceled here recently because of the bid ask, particularly when it involves gas. The second sort of main theme that's out there that we are watching for the future, and not just today, is really this concept of energy addition. We prefer to talk about that rather than energy transition, because when you think of it, we will need energy of all sources as we go forward. When we think about the energy addition, it's about speed. If anything we learned from the geopolitical issues that are happening, in particular the Ukrainian war, the number one thing is about the speed of how these additions will come on. That was very evident not only at CERAWeek in the last year, but also particularly when you look at the earnings of the global majors in Europe. Almost all of them have said that they will think about things and the ramp up of their renewable businesses on a different timeline. The third thing that's on everyone's radar right now is back to my own side of the equation, which is upstream. Upstream for a while sort of was a word that you didn't hear much about, was something in particular exploration, which was sort of a silent E. It's now become very recognized that in order for us to continue to provide energy beyond the future of 2030 and even beyond 2050, we're going to need more supply. Now, that supply in particular will be oil from Latin America, where both Guyana, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico will continue to play a pivotal role, as well as possibly Argentina with some exports. But when we look at the overall scenarios, we see that potentially we may need more oil. We may be short. So we'll talk about that in a little bit later. Natural gas is the other side of the equation. And of course, we all know how important that is, and particularly in Latin America, for getting us through the winter. So upstream is back, and upstream has a critical role to play. So those would be my top three when we think about things from that standpoint. Felipe.
Yep. Thanks, Bob, and thanks, Eden. It's a pleasure to be talking to Arpel and the community that Arpel embraces. And then I'll make the link to the last thing Bob said, right? Supply. And as the downstream is the main demand for crude oil, we know that there's still demand growth happening in the world. And we will continue to need, as Bob mentioned very well, the addition of other energies, but the crude oil, the traditional fuels are not going to go away very fast. And different regions might be moving in different speeds, but we know that the base needs to sustain that transition and different paces in different regions. One issue to be on the radar, I think, for this year and the next year is we're still in a very volatile period. I think there's still a lot of uncertainties. Crude oil markets, refined products markets tend to have some volatility is inherited is part of the business, but as we know, we are still in a moment in history of additional instability, additional vulnerability, I would say, with the conflicts we have in Europe, global disruption in relationships among nations, and of course, on top of that, we have the economy still struggling a little bit to take off around the world. So how those things will shape up in the next year or so is very important. This is looking at the short term. And then long term, we know that the energy transition has taken off. It's not anymore just a terminology. It's part of the reality, the day-to-day actions and operations of companies, of all energy companies, all energy sectors. Of course, we know how much of the emphasis in energy transition it is in the transportation sector, right? And we started with a lot of the discussions of electrification of vehicles. Now we see substitution of jet fuel, for example, with sustainable aviation fuel and so on. So we'll see a lot of those challenges happening in the long term for the downstream sector. And of course, it connects to the upstream and how the industry, how the supply chain of energy and feedstocks as well. We cannot forget the role that the downstream, the refining plays, not only on the energy sector, but also in the feedstock sector for petrochemicals. And we know we need petrochemicals for the life we live today, right? So those issues I think are key to keep in mind. And for Latin America is how we are affected, right, on this transition and all those changes. Because again, right, the crude oil markets, the refined products markets are global markets. We all look at regionally, but we are all connected. And things that can happen, changes in market conditions that can happen in other regions, for example, Europe or the United States, will have a significant impact to the industry, to the downstream industry in Latin America. We know Latin America is very dependent on imports. And what does that mean, right, in the short term, long term? On several discussions, and I think we're going to touch that on that next, is the whole discussion: energy security, energy transition, affordability of energy, and that is playing a major role for Latin America. As we know, those three items are very important, and it will be impacted not only on the pace of the energy transition in Latin America, but how this global market, this interconnected market, responds and moves forward in this path for energy transition and energy addition, going back to Bob's point.
So when we start to think then about CERAWeek, so CERAWeek we just had in early March, it was a record year, and luckily enough, Latin America was well represented with well over almost 400 attendees from Latin America. It was a very different mode. The mood was very different, and particularly it was one where, to Felipe, to your points that you just raised, that one of the key things, of course, was this trilemma. And it kicked off really around thinking about the intersection, or the nexus, if you would, between energy poverty, energy security, and emissions as we go forward, and how that all creates sort of an economic security for people. And that's been a problem that's been rising to the surface. You saw it at COP27. You've seen it throughout most of the discussions now recently on climate, but it was front and center for CERAWeek. One of the things that was sort of if you would, a kind of a tag along to that was the notion, though, that despite the fact that things like the IRA, which are hundreds of billions of dollars out there to help with the energy addition of getting the renewables out there, getting hydrogen built and running with ammonia, also with getting carbon capture and storage to help with the abatement issues. One of the critical issues that became a reality that was a focus, particularly from the U.S. administration, as well as all of the speakers, was this issue of permitting. It's nothing new for Latin America. We've faced that for decades in Latin America. It's been a primary problem for many countries here of late. It's now becoming a whole different issue when we start to think about metals and the metals and minerals that are needed for getting the wind on, getting batteries going, getting all these sorts of new things together for this sort of new economy, if you would, is going to require a lot more minerals. So there was a realization that we are not going to hit any targets without solving the permitting problem. And so it doesn't matter whether it's oil or gas, whether it's minerals, whether it's roads, transmission lines, pipelines for CO2, all of those are, and particularly now waking up in the United States, that this is a critical issue. You just saw, I was just on the Capitol Hill 2 weeks ago, meeting with congressmen, and they passed the first bill, HR 1, which is to address these permitting rules. But just think within your own country, the issues that we've always had about permitting, and then think forward for the ramp up and the scale that we need for renewables to be effective as we go forward. So that's one of the critical takeaways from CERAWeek from that standpoint. And then the other one really goes back to one of my earlier points, which was about the Europeans in particular waking up to the fact that this whole thing is going to take a lot longer. And therefore, quite frankly, they're going to need to adjust some of their targets out further. Please, Irene. Oh, sorry, I thought you had a question. And so that's a critical thing. And then lastly, the thing that's a good takeaway from CERAWeek has been gas. Gas is going to be very important to the future. Felipe.
No, absolutely. CERAWeek really set a different standard of the discussion of the issues and the level of the conversation in the oil and gas industry that will be very important for the near future and so on. I think one takeaway I have from CERAWeek discussions is definitely what you mentioned, the Inflation Reduction Act, the package that the U.S. passed on to push forward that is beyond just energy transitions, being how the United States can stay competitive. And that has the implications, right? If you're reading between the lines, how does that accelerate, right? For example, electrification of the fleet in the United States. And then, the United States goes to have even a bigger surplus of gasoline and diesel and so on, right? They will try to find a market and compete globally, right? On that, even though it's still on the hydrocarbon basis, but we know how strong the refining industry is in the United States and the US Gulf Coast. And that will have implications to the world, right? Europeans and the rest of the world look at the IRA as we need to shape up and stay competitive in all sectors of the energy industry, but it is a game changer. Obviously, permitting is something that is an issue in the United States and globally common in Latin America. And the other takeaway from CERAWeek is in all that discussion is that downstream is not going to go away, right? I think that's very important. There was a lot of concerns and a lot of discussion. What is the future of refining, right? So how is that refining going to shape? Definitely is going to be a lot different what are we seeing of the latest investments in Latin America. Latin America with this trilemma that Bob mentioned, right? Affordability, energy poverty, issues with high energy prices, right? The investments in the downstream sector are still thinking on energy security and trying to guarantee supply at a low cost, things that are very difficult, but it's still on a model that is not fully aligned with the transition that we will have for the refining sector. That will be more integrated with energy sources. We will be more integrated with carbon capture, for example. And that reality still hasn't come to Latin America, which is going to be very difficult in terms of the competitiveness of the region and the refining industry of Latin America against other centers. We might have a different story in Europe, perhaps just taking the big leap, right? Going into, we may not even need refining at all, right? But you have other regions that will have a major presence in the market. And at the end, you need to stay competitive. And I think that will be a point of discussion in the short term and the long term for the refining sector in Latin America. Again, there's still different paces. We know Latin America is still moving a little bit slower in energy transition. Different countries have different energy matrices that can be considered greener or not so much, but we understand that for the day-to-day reality of our lives, we still rely on gasoline. We still rely a lot on diesel to move the economy, to move people, and how that will shape up in the future with all those changes we saw in all these conversations during CERA Week. I think it's very important for the future leaders that we'll be discussing in the leadership program needs to keep in mind across the board, from those that are looking at upstream, downstream, oil, gas and power. All those sectors need to be looked, on a holistic way.
Excelente. Bueno, vayamos ahora en concreto al programa de Arpel de alta gerencia. Con este contexto que brindaron, les voy a hacer unas preguntas a ti, Bob, respecto al módulo 1 como principal instructor, y a ti, Felipe, respecto al módulo 2. En primer lugar, ¿cuáles son los 3 contenidos más relevantes del módulo? Empecemos por Bob.
Thank you, Ryan. So, yeah, the critical thing then, that's what we were trying to set up here today, was some of the things that we'll be probing in the leadership. And so in module 1, 3 quick takeaways from that is really about thinking about the company of the future. What will your company look like in the future? And how does that compare with other models that are out there outside of Latin America? We'll do that through looking at first scenarios. So what are the global scenarios when we look at things as far as the uncertainties? And then we'll look at that at the Latin America scenarios. So what's happening there? The second thing that we're going to really focus then on those are the options. What are the options? What business model options do you have then, given that uncertainty of the future, to help you chart this pathway as you go forward as a new company? And the company of the future is going to look a lot different, just like the basin of the future is going to a lot different. And so those will be kind of the 3 main things, but what we're going to do is bring it home by getting you to think about what will your company look like in the future. That's module 1. Felipe.
Thanks, Bob. I would say, first, it's very important to understand the fundamentals of the industry, right? So I think we need to lay out the ground, and particularly because we want to make the program broad and that gives it this broader view of the industry. So, but to be able to understand a different sector and how it's connected, like for example with the upstream, sector, right? We need to understand those fundamentals. I think that's number one point of the program. Second is then challenges, right? How will you tackle challenges? How you think strategically, because, assuming that we are forming the future leaders, right? So you understand what we've been talking about, right? How we can break the mindset, I think sometimes that is so difficult in Latin America because of the composition of the industry to stay competitive, that instead of just looking in the future and waiting for a future that never comes to be the present in Latin America, how these new leaders can take the industry, break the mindset, and be the leaders, the industry be the leaders in the near future. I think that's very important, that we'll be discussing that. It's not just to be a critic, but to open the eyes of the leaders for those challenges and opportunities. I think at the end of the day, right, that's the third point that we want to bring, that the leaders understand the fundamentals, see challenges, but also think, okay, what opportunities I will have for my company, for my industry, for my country, Latin America, in this world that is changing, and it's going to change in different directions when we think about energy, right, that we know. And we kind of have the old models in a way, which is still relevant, but we need to be aware of other opportunities as well, and how to fit all those pieces, right, in that change, and not just continue on a status quo that we know is going to be very difficult to provide to the economy of Latin America.
Excelente, clarísimo. Bueno, estamos en hora y hay una pregunta, Elena Mendoza, que creo que la respuesta sería muy extensa y me parece que lo ideal es que se una al programa, porque en definitiva, participando va a tener esa respuesta. Ella pregunta recomendaciones para incorporar la transición energética en la región para empresas privadas de porte medio. O sea, es una pregunta muy amplia realmente, y que justamente es lo que contempla este programa. Así que la invitamos a Elena que nos solicite más información sobre el programa. Estamos ya pasados de hora, voy a agradecer muchísimo nuevamente a Bob y a Felipe. Realmente nos complace mucho contar con profesionales de este nivel en nuestro programa de liderazgo. Hemos trabajado juntos en el diseño del contenido para cubrir todas las herramientas que cada líder necesita para solucionar problemas y navegar en la incertidumbre. Este programa fue creado especialmente para los líderes del sector petróleo y gas. Cuenta con 3 módulos en 3 ciudades diferentes en esta edición 2023. El primer módulo en Bucaramanga, Colombia, el segundo en Houston, Estados Unidos, y el tercero en Monterrey, México, con una metodología que es en base a presentaciones, casos de estudio, simulaciones y sesiones muy interactivas con expertos como Bob y Felipe. Este webinar de estrategias en la industria del petróleo y sus principales desafíos muestra apenas una parte muy escueta de lo que se va a analizar en el programa con profundidad. Van a obtener herramientas para analizar estos aspectos y los próximos desafíos del petróleo y gas con una visión estratégica de largo plazo. El módulo 1, como bien decía Bob, sobre factores globales y su efecto en el sector upstream de Latinoamérica, va a realizarse en Bucaramanga, Colombia, desde el próximo 30 de mayo al 1 de junio, y el plazo para postularse vence el 28 de abril. En los próximos días les vamos a compartir la grabación de este evento y más información sobre el programa para todos los interesados. Así que, sin más, ya estamos en tiempo. Agradecer nuevamente a todos y desearles un excelente final de jornada.
Chao.
Chau, chau.